I never told my son about my $130,000 salary. When I said I couldn't pay for my doctor, he replied, "That's your problem. Figure it out yourself. I quietly changed my will." When he found out. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Margaret Holloway. Most people call me Peggy. I am 68 years old, and I spent 41 of those years as a senior accountant at a mid-size financial firm in Columbus, Ohio. I retired 3 years ago with a pension, a modest investment portfolio, and a salary history that peaked at $130,000 a year. I lived in the same house for 32 years, a cream-colored colonial on Birchwood Lane, with a garden my late husband Gerald planted the spring before his heart gave out. I had a good life, a quiet life, the kind of life you build brick by brick without anyone noticing until it's done. My son Derek is 43. He works in sales, medical equipment, the kind of job where the money is good when the quarters are good and miserable when they aren't. He married Stacy 17 years ago. Stacy is the kind of woman who smiles with her teeth and watches you with her eyes. I noticed that about her at the wedding, but told myself I was being an old fool. Gerald liked her. Gerald liked everyone. After Gerald died, Derek started coming around more. At first, it felt like love. He called twice a week. He took me to dinner on Sundays. He helped me with the gutters in October. I felt less alone, and I was grateful. A widow's gratitude is a powerful thing. It can blind you to a great deal. The first request came 8 months after the funeral. Derek said he and Stacy were a little short that month, a slow quarter, nothing serious. Could I lend them $4,000 for the mortgage? I wrote the check that same afternoon. He was my son. Gerald would have done the same thing. The second request came 4 months later, then a third, then a pattern so regular I should have seen it as a system rather than a series of emergencies. A car repair here, private school tuition for the grandchildren there, a medical bill, a legal fee, a home repair that couldn't wait. Over the course of 2.5 years, I gave Derek $78,000. I counted it later, sitting at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a cup of cold coffee. $78,000. The number sat on the page like a stone, but I said nothing, because I told myself it was family. Because I told myself the money would come back someday. Because Derek always said, "Thank you, Mom," with such warmth that I believed the warmth was real. I never once mentioned my salary. Derek knew I was comfortable. I had the house, the car, the garden. But I kept the specifics private, an old habit from my accounting days. You don't tell people what you have unless you want them to decide what to do with it. The breaking point came on a Thursday in March. I had been having trouble with my left knee for 6 months. The pain had progressed from a nuisance to something that woke me at 3 in the morning and made the stairs a negotiation. My doctor referred me to an orthopedic specialist, and the specialist recommended a procedure, not surgery, but a series of injections and physical therapy, that my insurance covered only partially. The out-of-pocket cost was $2,200. I had the money. Of course I had the money. But I had also just transferred $6,500 to Derek 2 weeks earlier for what he called a gap in the business account. My savings buffer, which I kept deliberately modest so I wouldn't be tempted to overspend, had dipped lower than I liked. I decided to call Derek, not to ask for the money back, just to tell him what was happening. I think I wanted to hear his voice. I think I wanted him to say, "Mom, do you need anything?" He picked up on the third ring. I told him about the knee. about the specialist, about the $2,200. There was a pause on the line. Then Derek said, in a tone I had never heard from him before, flat, almost bored, "Mom, that's your problem. Figure it out yourself." And he hung up. I stood in my kitchen for a long time after that. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a cardinal landed on Gerald's old bird feeder and was gone. I looked at the phone in my hand. I looked at the garden through the window, and something shifted inside me. Quietly, the way ice shifts before it breaks. I thought, when did my son become a stranger? And then I thought something colder, something more precise. How much of this did I build with my own hands? I did not cry that night. I had expected to. I had cried after Gerald died. Cried in the car on the way home from the funeral. Cried folding his shirts. But that Thursday evening, after Derek hung up, I sat at my kitchen table with the legal pad and the cold coffee. And I felt something different. Not grief. Something harder. I wrote down every transfer, every check, every Venmo payment and wire and cash envelope I had handed to my son over the past 31 months. I had the records. I was an accountant for 41 years. I kept everything. Bank statements, texts where Derek said he'd pay me back, a few email threads with Stacy that now read very differently in light of that phone call. The total was $78,400. I stared at the number until it stopped feeling like money and started feeling like a portrait. A portrait of my own willingness to believe what I wanted to believe. Then I made a second list. What I actually had, the house, paid off, worth approximately $310,000 in the current market. My pension, $3,200 a month. My investment accounts, $214,000, conservatively managed. My savings, $41,000, now lower than I liked because of the recent transfers. The car, the furniture, a small life insurance policy that had been sitting in a folder in the filing cabinet since Gerald and I took it out in 1994. And then, beneath both lists, I wrote one more number. $130,000. My salary. The number Derek had never asked about and I had never offered. The number that, if he had known it, might have made him even more aggressive in his asking. I thought about that for a long time. There was fear, yes. I would be dishonest if I said there wasn't. Derek was not a violent man, but he was a persuasive one, and Stacy was sharper than he was. She understood leverage, and she understood how to make you feel guilty for protecting yourself. If I changed course, if I stopped the money and said enough, they would push back. I knew that with the certainty you develop after 68 years of watching people, but the fear did something unexpected that night. It clarified me, because I realized that the alternative, doing nothing, continuing the transfers, waiting for Derek to decide I had given enough, was its own kind of slow destruction. The $2,200 knee procedure was not the wound. The wound was the phone call. The flatness in his voice. That's your problem. Figure it out yourself. He had said those words to his mother, who had given him $78,400 and raised him for 18 years and buried his father alone so he wouldn't have to take time off work. That was who Derek had become. And I had helped him become it, one check at a time. I went to bed at midnight and lay in the dark, listening to the house settle. Gerald's side of the bed was still cooler than mine, some habit of the mattress I hadn't been able to fix. I thought about what Gerald would say. Gerald was a gentle man, but he was not a weak one. He used to say, "Peg, you can love somebody and still hold them accountable. Those aren't opposites." By morning, I had a plan. Not a dramatic plan, not the kind of thing that happens in movies. A quiet, careful, legal plan. The kind an accountant builds when she realizes the books have been mismanaged and it's time to do a proper audit. Step 1. I would call my attorney. Not the family attorney Derek knew about, but a separate one. An estate planning specialist I had met at a financial seminar 2 years ago, and whose card I had kept in the back of my address book. Her name was Ellen Marsh. I would call Ellen and I would ask her to review my will and my financial documents. No explanations, just a review. Step 2. I would stop all transfers. Immediately, completely, without announcement. Derek would notice, but I wanted him to notice after the legal work was done, not before. Step 3. I would get the knee procedure. I would pay the $2,200 from my savings, and I would not mention it to Derek. And I would walk without pain again, and that would be the first thing I did entirely for myself in 3 years. Step 4. And this one I only allowed myself to think about in the abstract because it was the one that made my hands tremble slightly. I would quietly, carefully begin to restructure what I left behind. What went to whom, and how. I picked up the phone the next morning and called Ellen Marsh. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was calm and professional, and exactly what I needed to hear. Ellen, I said, I need to come in as soon as possible. Something has changed, and I need my affairs to reflect that. She said, I have Thursday at 2. I said, I'll be there. I hung up, made a cup of tea, and looked at the garden. The tulips Gerald had planted along the fence were just beginning to push through the cold ground. Red ones. He always chose red. You were right, Gerald, I thought. You can love somebody and still hold them accountable. Ellen Marsh's office was on the 14th floor of a glass building downtown, the kind of place where the carpet is thick and the receptionist remembers your name. I had been there once before, 2 years ago, for a general estate consultation after Gerald's death. At the time, I had made only small adjustments, a minor bequest to our church, an update to the executor clause. Nothing that would have signaled to anyone that anything was changing. This visit was different. I arrived 10 minutes early, which is my habit, and I sat in the waiting room with my folder of documents. Bank statements, the legal pad with my lists, a copy of the existing will, Gerald's death certificate, which Ellen had needed before and might need again. The receptionist brought me coffee without asking. I drank it and watched the city below and thought about the word estate. Such a formal word for a woman who grew tomatoes and drove a 7-year-old Buick. Ellen came out to get me herself. She was in her early 50s, precise in the way that good lawyers are precise. Every word chosen, no energy wasted. We sat in her office and I laid out the documents and I told her everything. The transfers, the amounts, the patterns, the phone call about the knee. I was calm while I told it, the way you are calm when you've already made the decision, and the telling is just information, not plea. Ellen listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, then said, Peggy, has Derek ever signed anything acknowledging these as loans rather than gifts? I had thought about this. A few texts where he said he'd pay me back, nothing formal. She nodded slowly. That's difficult to enforce, but not impossible to document. What's your primary concern right now? Recouping the money or protecting the estate going forward? Going forward, I said. The money I gave him, I've accepted that it's gone. I want to make sure that what remains goes where I intend. Then let's start there, she said, and she opened her legal pad. We spent 2 hours in that office. By the time I left, Ellen had everything she needed to draft a revised will and a separate letter of instruction. A private document that would not be filed publicly, but would guide the executor. I also signed a healthcare proxy update Because the existing one named Derek, and I was no longer comfortable with that. Ellen walked me to the elevator. "One thing," she said. "Don't tell anyone you've been here. Not yet. Let me get the documents drafted first." "I wasn't planning to," I said. She smiled for the first time that afternoon. "Good. I'll have a draft to you within 2 weeks." The problem was that I had parked on the same block as the coffee shop where Stacy had her Tuesday morning standing meetup with her friend group. I did not know this until I was already walking to my car, and I heard her voice. That particular bright social voice Stacy used when she was performing friendliness. From a table by the window, I kept walking. I did not look, but I saw, in the reflection of a store window, that Stacy had seen me. She was watching me walk past Ellen Marsh's building with my folder under my arm. I saw her head tilt, the way a person's head tilts when something doesn't fit. It was a small thing, but I had been an accountant for 41 years, and I knew that small discrepancies, ignored, become large ones. I drove home and sat in the driveway for a moment. She saw me, I thought. Now the clock is running. That evening, I did something I had been putting off. I went to my filing cabinet, the tall gray one in the spare room that Gerald always called the archive, and I pulled every document related to my financial relationship with Derek. I had been meticulous. Of course I had been meticulous. I was a woman who color-coded her tax folders. Among the bank statements and check carbons and printed emails, I found something I had forgotten. A text thread from 14 months ago in which Derek had written, word for word, "Mom, you're a lifesaver. I promise I'll pay every cent back when Q3 closes. You know I'm good for it." And beneath that, a screenshot I had taken without thinking. A screenshot of Stacy's text to Derek that had accidentally been sent to me instead of him. 6 words. 6 words that had landed in my inbox like a stone through glass. Did she say how much is left? I had read it at the time and told myself I was misreading the tone, that she meant something else, that I was being paranoid. I read it again now, in the quiet of the spare room 14 months later, with $78,400 on my legal pad. I was not misreading anything. I photographed both texts with my phone, emailed them to myself, and then forwarded them to Ellen Marsh with a note that said, "Additional documentation. Please include in the file." Then I went to the kitchen, made dinner, and ate alone at the table where Gerald and I had eaten together for 29 years. The tulips were still pushing through the ground outside the window, slow, steady, certain. So am I thought. The draft will arrive from Ellen 12 days later. I read it at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a red pen, the way I used to read financial reports. Line by line, no skimming. It was thorough. Ellen had restructured the estate in 4 clear directions. The house would go to a charitable remainder trust, with the church and a local women's shelter as named beneficiaries. My investment accounts would be divided between my 2 grandchildren, Derek's kids, Emma and Tyler, held in a protected educational trust that neither Derek nor Stacy could access or redirect. A separate bequest went to my sister Carol in Arizona. A small amount was designated for my neighbor Ruth, who had been checking on me twice a week since Gerald died, without once asking for anything in return. Derek received a specific bequest, $1,000, the legal minimum to demonstrate that the omission was intentional and not an oversight. Ellen had suggested this language carefully. It made the document harder to challenge. I signed where Ellen told me to sign. 2 witnesses came in from the outer office. The notary stamped the page. It took 11 minutes. Walking out of Ellen's building that second time, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not relief, but a kind of structural solidity, as if a wall that had been leaning for years had finally been straightened. I stopped all transfers that same week. No text to Derek, no explanation. I simply stopped. He called on a Friday evening, 17 days after my visit to Ellen. His voice had the careful warmth he used when he wanted something, that particular lightness that I now recognize the way you recognize a weather pattern that always precedes a storm. "Hey, Mom, haven't heard from you in a while. Everything okay?" "Everything's fine, Derek. I just wanted to check in. Stacy mentioned she thought she saw you downtown a couple weeks ago." There it is, I thought. "I had some appointments," I said. "Everything okay with your health?" He paused. "The knee? Better," I said. "I took care of it." Another pause. Longer. "Listen, Mom, Q1 was rough. We're sitting on a gap in the household account, and the kids' school fees are due at the end of the month. I was hoping—" "Derek," I said, "I won't be able to help with that." The warmth in his voice dropped like a temperature gauge in January. "What do you mean?" "I mean I won't be helping financially. Not right now, not in the near future." Silence. Then, "Is this because of what I said? About the knee?" "This is about my financial situation," I said. "I need to be more careful. I'm sure you understand." He did not say I understand. He said, "Mom, I don't know what's going on with you, but this is not a good time to be playing games." And then he hung up. I sat with the phone in my lap and breathed. The cardinal was back on the feeder. I watched it for a while. 3 days later, Derek and Stacy drove to the house unannounced. It was a Saturday morning. I saw the car pull up from the kitchen window, and I felt the first cold flutter of something that was not quite fear, but was adjacent to it. I opened the door before they could ring the bell. Stacy had her social smile on. Derek looked tired and tight around the jaw. "Mom," he said, "we need to talk." I let them in because I was not going to have this conversation on the porch. We sat in the living room, the formal one, not the den where I usually sat with family. The choice of room was intentional. This was not a family visit. Derek said they had been talking, and they were concerned about me. Was I confused about my finances? Had someone been giving me advice? He asked the word advice the way you'd ask about a suspicious stranger. Stacy said, very gently, that sometimes older people made decisions they later regretted when they were going through things emotionally. I looked at her. I looked at Derek. I said, "I am 68 years old, not 88. I have an accounting degree and 41 years of professional experience. I am not confused." Derek's voice shifted. The warmth was gone entirely now. "Mom, if you've changed your will, you need to know that can be challenged. We'd hate for things to get legal. We're family. We'd hate for things to get legal," said in a living room, to his mother, 2 weeks after telling her that her knee pain was her problem. I stood up. "I think it's time for you to go," I said. They went. But at the door, Derek turned back. "You're making a mistake," he said. And Stacy, behind him, said nothing, which was worse than anything she could have said. After they left, I called Carol in Arizona. She listened to the whole story without interrupting, and when I was done, she said, "Peg, you've already done the hard part. Everything else is just holding the line." She was right, but I was tired. I gave myself 4 days. I planted the rest of the garden. I walked the neighborhood in the mornings. I ate dinner with Ruth next door twice, and we talked about nothing important, and it was the most restorative thing I had done in months. On the 4th day, I felt steady again. The wall was still straight. The call came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Derek and Stacy's visit to the house. Not from Derek. From Stacy's mother, Diane, whom I had not spoken to in 4 years. Diane was a soft-spoken woman from Georgia, who had always made me feel, in a polite and indecipherable way, slightly inferior. She called in the early evening, when the light through the kitchen window was amber, and the garden was casting long shadows. "Peggy," she said, "I've been hearing some things and I just want to reach out as one mother to another." I let her talk. She talked for 11 minutes. The gist of it was this: Derek and Stacy were struggling, the children were suffering, and a woman of my financial position had a moral obligation to her family. She said the phrase, "what Gerald would have wanted," twice. She said "the children" 5 more times. The children. Emma was 12 and Tyler was 9. I loved them with a specific and uncomplicated love that had nothing to do with their parents. I had put them both in the educational trust precisely because I loved them. But Diane was using them as a crowbar, and we both knew it. When she finished, I said, "Diane, I appreciate your call. My plans are in place and they won't be changing." I said it pleasantly because I had nothing against Diane specifically, and I hung up. I poured myself a small glass of wine and sat in the garden until dark. Was it tempting? I would be lying if I said it wasn't. Not because of the money. I had made peace with the money months ago. But because of the loneliness that lives at the edge of a decision like the one I had made. When you restructure your relationship with your child, you restructure your relationship with your future. You close the door on a version of your old age that involved Sunday dinners and grandchildren at the table, and a son who drove you to your appointments and held your hand when things got hard. That door was already closed, of course. Derek had closed it with a flat voice on a Thursday in March. But grief doesn't care about logic. I thought about Gerald. I thought about the 41 years I had been careful and deliberate and good at my job. I thought about the $78,400 and the text message. Did she say how much is left? And I thought about my knee, which no longer woke me at 3 in the morning since the procedure, and I thought about the cardinal on the feeder. The temptation passed, the way cold passes when the sun comes out, not dramatically, just gone. I also noticed in those weeks that I was being watched. Not in any dramatic sense. No one was parked outside the house. But Derek left a comment on a Facebook post of mine for the first time in 2 years. Stacy texted a photo of the grandchildren with no message, which was not her habit. 2 of Derek's college friends, whom I had never spoken to independently, both happened to be in my neighborhood running errands, or so they said. They mentioned Derek, casually, sympathetically. I recognized the reconnaissance. I had seen it in business. When people know something is happening that affects them, they gather information. I gave them nothing. I was warm, pleasant, and completely opaque. But I also understood that I needed people in my corner who were not connected to Derek in any way. Ruth, my neighbor, already knew more than she let on. She had seen Derek's car at the house that Saturday and had texted afterward. "Everything okay?" Looked tense. I had said yes and changed the subject. Now I told her more. Not everything, but enough. Ruth was 71, had been divorced twice, and had a look in her eye that suggested she had navigated difficult people her entire life. She said, "Good for you, Peggy," without any drama. And then she offered to drive me to my attorney's office any time I needed it because she said it was better to have a witness in the car than not. I also called a friend from my accounting days, Barbara, who had retired to Cincinnati, but who was sharp as she had ever been. I told her the numbers. Barbara whistled softly and said, $78,000. Peg. That's not a family loan. That's a revenue stream. She was not wrong. Barbara also said something that stayed with me. "You know what the worst thing they can do is?" she said. "Make you doubt yourself. Don't let them make you doubt yourself." I wrote that down on the legal pad. I did not doubt myself. They came back 6 weeks later. It was a Sunday afternoon in early May, and they called ahead this time. Derek, with his careful voice, asking if he could come by and, "Just talk, Mom, no pressure." I said yes, because I knew this conversation was coming and I wanted it done. I called Ruth before they arrived and told her what time they were expected. Ruth said she would be home and to call if I needed anything. I made a pot of coffee I did not intend to offer them, just to have something to do with my hands while I waited. Derek and Stacy arrived together, 7 minutes early. Stacy was carrying flowers, yellow tulips, which was a choice that felt calculated in a way I could not entirely explain, since they matched the ones Gerald had planted along the fence every spring for 20 years. I took the flowers and put them in a vase and set the vase on the counter without a word. I did not say what I was thinking. We sat in the den this time, which was Derek's choice and which I allowed. The den was softer. Family photos on the shelves, Gerald's armchair in the corner, the quilt my mother had sewn for our 25th anniversary. I noticed Stacy's eyes moving across the photos as she sat down. Gerald and me on the porch, Derek's school pictures, Emma and Tyler at the beach 2 summers ago. She was reading the room the way you read a room when you are planning how to use it. Derek started gently. He was sorry for what he'd said about the knee. He'd been under enormous pressure that month, work, the house, the kids, and it had come out wrong. He didn't mean it. He loved me. He missed the way things used to be, Sundays together, the way the family felt when Dad was still here. He wanted things to go back to the way they were. I said, "I appreciate that, Derek," Stacy said. "We just want you to know that whatever you've been told, by whoever, we're your family. And family works things out. Whoever." As if I had been steered by an outside party. As if I were a woman who required management. I noticed the word and filed it. I said, "No one has told me anything." Stacy leaned forward slightly. Her voice stayed warm. That particular warmth that requires effort to maintain, the kind you can hear working. "Peggy, we know you've been going through a lot since Gerald passed. Grief is a long process, and sometimes it can make things feel distorted. You might be interpreting certain situations in ways that don't reflect reality." She tilted her head, the picture of gentle concern. "We're worried about you. We think it might help to speak to someone, a therapist, even a doctor, just to make sure you're doing okay." And there it was. Neatly done, I had to admit. Concern about my mental state. Soft, well delivered, positioned as care. If I had changed my will in a state of grief-induced confusion or emotional instability, that was precisely the language a contested will proceeding would need. They were laying the groundwork, planting seeds in front of me, expecting me not to recognize the crop. I looked at Stacy for a long, unhurried moment. Then I looked at Derek. His eyes moved to the side, just slightly, just for a second. And that one small motion told me everything I needed to know about who had written this script. I said, "I'm not going through anything, Stacy. I'm thinking quite clearly." I kept my voice warm, because warmth was available to me, too. "Is there something specific you'd like to discuss? My attorney has all the documents in order, so if there are any legal questions, she can address them directly." The word attorney landed in the room like a window opening in winter. Derek's jaw tightened, a small movement, almost invisible, and Stacy's smile stayed precisely in place, but the quality behind her eyes changed. The performance had encountered resistance it hadn't fully anticipated. Derek said, "Mom, if you've done something with the will, I need to know. I'm your son." "The will is a private matter," I said. "That's standard practice, as I'm sure you know." "You're cutting me out." The careful warmth was gone now, fully, and what replaced it was something rawer. "After everything, after all the years, all the support we gave you after Dad died. The support you gave me, I said, still calmly. Derek, in the 2.5 years after your father died, I gave you $78,400. During that same period, you visited 6 times, called approximately twice a month. And when I told you I needed help with a medical procedure, you told me it was my problem and hung up. I let that sit for exactly 1 moment. I'm not cutting you out. I'm making informed, deliberate decisions about my own estate. That is my legal right. Stacy stood up. Her composure was intact, but the warmth had curdled at the edges. This is not who you are, Peggy. Gerald would be heartbroken to see this. Gerald would understand, I said. Better than anyone. Derek stood. His face was flushed, color moving up from his collar. You know we can contest this. In Ohio, undue influence is a recognized legal ground for challenging estate documents. I know Ohio estate law, I said evenly. I also know what constitutes evidence of undue influence and what doesn't. I suggest you speak to your own attorney before you make claims you can't support in court. I stood as well, smoothed my cardigan, and picked up my coffee cup. I'll see you both out. They left. Stacy took her purse from the chair with a deliberateness that was its own form of statement. At the door, Derek turned back. His voice had dropped, not to gentleness, but to something lower, more careful. You're making a mistake, he said. You'll regret isolating yourself. Stacy said nothing, which was, as I had noted before, worse than anything she might have said aloud. The door closed. The house settled into its familiar quiet. I stood in the hallway and did not move for a full minute. My hands were steady. My heart was not. It was beating harder than I would have liked, a physical response I could not entirely override with reason. There was fear, genuine, chest-level fear. The undue influence comment was not bluster. It was a mapped legal avenue, and a challenge, even a failed one, meant months of proceedings, attorney fees, emotional exposure, the airing of private family matters in public documents. I had prepared for this possibility, but preparation and experience are different countries. What I noticed, though, sitting with that fear in the quiet of the hallway, was that it didn't make me want to retreat. It made me want to be more certain. The more clearly I saw what Derek and Stacy were willing to do, the calculated flowers, the scripted concern about my mental state, the legal threat delivered in Gerald's armchair, the more completely I understood that I had not overreacted. I had, if anything, been slow. Fear and resolve, I was learning, are not opposites. One can fuel the other if you let it. I called Ruth. They brought yellow tulips, I told her. Calculated, Ruth said immediately without hesitation. That's exactly what I thought. Are you all right? I looked around the den, at Gerald's armchair, at the family photos, at the quilt my mother had made, at the tulips in the vase on the counter, which were actually quite beautiful and deserved better than the purpose they'd been assigned. I'm all right, I said, and I meant it completely. The decisive moment came in June, at what had been planned as a birthday lunch for Tyler, my grandson's 10th birthday. I had agreed to attend because Tyler had called me himself, in his 10-year-old voice that still cracked sometimes when he got excited, and asked me please to come. I was not going to disappoint Tyler for anything in the world. Some things are not negotiable, and my grandson's birthday was one of them. The lunch was at Derek and Stacy's house, a colonial in Westerville that they had bought 6 years ago, and that I now knew, partially subsidized. I drove myself. I told Ellen Marsh's office where I was going, and approximately when I expected to be home, which was perhaps excessive, but which felt like the right kind of thoroughness. I also wore comfortable shoes, because I wanted to be able to leave quickly and without complication if the afternoon required it. There were 8 people there: me, Derek, Stacy, Emma, and Tyler, Diane. Stacy's mother, who had flown in from Georgia, which I noted immediately as a logistical effort that had been planned in advance, and two of Derek and Stacy's mutual friends, a couple named Brad and Heather, who had been on the periphery of family events for years. Brad coached youth soccer and laughed easily. Heather had always been kind to me in the distracted way of people who are kind to everyone. I noted the composition of the room carefully. 8 people. Diane's flight from Georgia. A lunch on a Sunday with a guest list that mixed family and peripheral friends. This was not accidental. Tyler's birthday cake was chocolate with vanilla frosting and 10 candles. He wanted to sit next to me at the table, and I moved chairs without being asked. He chose mint chip ice cream when we got to that part of the afternoon, Gerald's favorite, which Tyler could not have known, and I held that small coincidence in my chest like a coal. After the cake, after the presents, after Tyler and Emma had been given permission to go outside and had taken themselves and their energy to the backyard, that was when Derek stood up. He had prepared something. I had known he would. I could see it in the set of his shoulders, in the way he glanced at Diane before he began, in the careful ordinariness of his opening tone. He said he wanted to take a moment, just a moment, he said, as if it were a small thing, to talk about something that had been weighing on the family. He looked at Diane and at Brad and Heather as he said it. He looked at them the way you look at people you have primed in advance. He said he was worried about his mother, that I had been withdrawing from the family over the past several months, making unusual decisions, seeking outside counsel without consulting anyone who loved me, and that he had recently learned I had made significant changes to my estate documents. He spoke carefully, gently, framing everything in concern rather than accusation. He said he believed I was not fully myself since Gerald's death, that grief was a complicated thing, that he only raised this now because he loved me and felt he had an obligation to say something before the situation became irreversible. Heather nodded. Brad looked at the tablecloth. Diane was absolutely still, her hands folded in her lap. I let Derek finish entirely. I did not interrupt. I did not shift in my seat. I sat with the posture of a woman who has been a professional for 41 years and has listened to a great many presentations she knew to be incorrect. I waited until the room had been quiet for 3 full seconds. Then I set my teacup down on the table, reached into my purse, and removed a manila folder. "I appreciate your concern, Derek," I said. My voice was level, not cold, not warm, simply factual. "Since you've chosen to have this conversation with others present, I'd like to share a few things with everyone here as well." I opened the folder and placed the first document on the table, the bank statement summary that Ellen had helped me prepare. 31 months of transfers organized by date and amount. Over the past 31 months, I transferred $78,400 to Derek and Stacy. These are the records. I placed the second sheet beside it. During that same period, Derek's commission deposits exceeded $40,000 in 2 consecutive quarters. I have those records as well. The third document went down. The text thread. Derek's written promise to repay. Stacy opened her mouth. "I'm not finished," I said pleasantly. "I also received this text, sent to me by mistake." I placed the screenshot in the center of the table where everyone at the table could see it clearly. 6 words. Did she say how much is left? And finally, because the question of my mental clarity has been raised, both today and on a previous occasion, I have here a written cognitive assessment conducted by my physician 8 weeks ago. No impairment of any kind was found. Ellen Marsh, my estate attorney, can provide her own professional assessment of my decision-making capacity, should that become necessary. The last sheet went down. I closed the folder and folded my hands on top of it. The room was a particular kind of quiet, not peaceful, but pressurized. The kind of quiet that follows something that cannot be unsaid or unseen. Heather was looking at the screenshot. Brad was looking at Derek. Diane had gone a color that was not quite white and not quite gray. Stacy's smile, that durable professional smile, was still on her face, but it had become disconnected from the rest of her expression, like a picture frame left hanging on a wall after the painting has been taken down. Derek said, "That text was, it's out of context." Stacy was asking about, "What context?" I asked. "Changes the meaning of did she say how much is left?" He stopped, started again. "Mom, you're making us look like—" "I'm sharing the same information you've shared," I said. "You invited Diane from Georgia. You invited Brad and Heather. You made a presentation to this group about my mental state. I'm completing the picture." "This is a private family matter," Stacy said. Her voice had lost its warmth and was operating on structure alone. "You had no right to bring legal documents to Tyler's birthday." "You had no right to use Tyler's birthday as a stage," I said, still pleasant, still factual. "But here we both are." Derek stood up. His chair scraped back too hard, and Tyler's remaining birthday balloons trembled near the ceiling from the disturbance. His face was deeply flushed, the kind of flush that starts at the jaw and moves upward. He pointed at the folder on the table, and then at me, and then seemed to lose the sentence he had prepared because his mouth moved once and then again without producing words. "I am your mother," I said quietly. "I love you. I have loved you for 43 years without condition. But I am also a competent adult with the right to manage my own affairs, and I have done so. Carefully, legally, and with full documentation." I stood. That's everything I wanted to say. I went to the back door and called Tyler and Emma inside. Tyler came in at a run, grass on his knees, and wrapped both arms around my waist in the uncomplicated way of 10-year-olds. I hugged him back, tightly, and for long enough to mean it. Emma stood beside me and looked at the room with those sharp 12-year-old eyes, and then looked at me. "You okay, Grandma?" she said quietly, just for me. "Better than okay," I told her. I smoothed her hair back from her forehead the way I used to when she was small. "Happy birthday to your brother. I love you both." I collected my purse and my folder. I walked through the living room and past Gerald's grandchildren and out through the front door into the June afternoon, which was warm and bright and smelled like cut grass from someone's lawn 2 houses down. Derek did not follow me. I sat in my car for 2 minutes before I started the engine. I was not crying. I was not shaking. I was, I discovered with some surprise, almost entirely calm. The kind of calm that lives on the other side of a long preparation, when the thing you have been ready for has finally arrived and passed. I drove home on the long way through the park with the windows down. The legal challenge came in July, as I had known it would. Derek's attorney filed a petition contesting the will on grounds of undue influence, that Ellen Marsh had improperly steered my estate planning decisions. It was, from a technical standpoint, a weak filing. Ellen told me so directly when she called. "It's a long shot," she said. "Your documentation is comprehensive, your cognitive assessment is clean, and your professional history makes an impaired elderly woman argument essentially impossible to sustain. But be prepared. This will take time." "How long?" 6 to 9 months if they push it. More likely they'll see how the early filings land and reassess." I thanked her, put down the phone, and made a pot of tea. The formal, legal act of my son contesting my right to determine the fate of my own estate produced in me something I hadn't anticipated. Not anger, not grief. A clear, settled sadness, the way you feel looking at a room you've finally decided to repaint, aware of what's been lost, ready for what comes next. I called Carol. I called Barbara. I did not call Derek. The challenge was dismissed in October, 14 weeks from filing to decision. The judge's written opinion ran 2 pages. The central finding: the record reflects a legally competent individual exercising deliberate and well-documented estate planning decisions in response to specific, verifiable interpersonal events. No evidence of undue influence was presented. Ellen had that sentence framed and sent it by courier. I put it in Gerald's filing cabinet in a folder labeled simply "Done." Derek's attorney had charged $23,000 for 14 weeks of work that produced a 2-page dismissal. The $78,400 was gone, and I had accepted that. The civil recovery path was narrow. Insufficient documentation of formal loans, litigation costs that would likely consume any recovery. I wrote it off in my personal ledger as a closed transaction. Money spent. Lesson complete. Non-recurring. Some losses are the cost of information you needed and now have. What held, precisely and completely, was the educational trust for Emma and Tyler. 4 years of college for each of them, held by Barbara as trustee, dispersible directly to the institution upon enrollment. Derek and Stacy had no access, no standing, no pathway through it. Barbara sent me quarterly confirmations, which I kept in a folder behind "Done," labeled "Growing." I began calling Emma and Tyler directly. Emma called Tuesday evenings and wanted to talk about books and marine biology documentaries. Tyler called weekend mornings, slightly out of breath from practice, narrating games in fragments. Neither mentioned their parents. I did not ask. That was not our relationship, and I kept it what it was: a grandmother and her grandchildren calling because they wanted to. I sent Carol a generous check in November, ahead of the will, simply because she had listened on that first Thursday night without once saying "I told you so," which is the rarest form of love. The house on Birchwood Lane remained mine. The garden was in its late autumn state, beds cleared, tulip bulbs tucked in for winter, rose canes tied back against the fence. Every year the red tulips returned without particular encouragement. Gerald had planted them the first spring after we moved in. Some things, once rooted properly, simply persist. I walked through the garden every morning with my coffee. No cane, no pain, no weight of something carried too long without noticing how heavy it had become. The books balanced, the wall was straight. Derek had a lawyer's invoice to pay, and I had a garden, a sister in Arizona, a neighbor who drove me places, and grandchildren who called on their own. That was enough. That was exactly enough. The following year was, without exaggeration, the best year I had lived since Gerald was alive. In September, I signed up for a watercolor class at the Community Arts Center, something I had wanted to do for 15 years and had always deferred because there was always someone else's need crowding the calendar. The instructor was a retired teacher named Frank, who had white hair and strong opinions about color theory and made the best coffee in any room he occupied. I was not particularly talented, but I was present, and I was pleased, and it turned out that was enough. In November, Ruth and I drove to Cincinnati for a long weekend to visit Barbara. We stayed in a hotel with a rooftop restaurant and talked until midnight 2 nights in a row. Barbara said I looked 10 years younger. Ruth said that was because I'd stopped carrying someone else's weight. They were both right in their different ways. I started walking every morning. Not for exercise specifically, but because I wanted to be outside, moving through the neighborhood with my own thoughts and no particular agenda. The knee was fine. The mornings were fine. There is a particular quality to happiness that you have earned through difficulty. It is quieter than the happiness of youth, but considerably more stable. It does not require anything to sustain it. It simply is. Emma came to stay for a week in July. She was 13 now, read a book a day, and asked me questions about Gerald and my accounting career and what I had wanted to be at her age. I told her I'd wanted to be a journalist and that I'd found numbers were their own kind of story. She thought about this, then said she wanted to be a marine biologist and a pastry chef simultaneously. I don't see why not, I said, and I meant it. Tyler came for Thanksgiving. He was growing fast and ate everything. He spent 2 hours playing catch in the backyard with Frank, who had become a quiet, steady presence in my life that I was examining gently and without pressure before dinner. Derek and Stacy's year was a different story. The legal fees for the failed will contest came to $23,000, borrowed from Stacy's brother, who wanted it back. Derek's sales numbers continued to decline, and in March he was placed on a performance improvement plan at work. In June, Stacy's part-time bookkeeping income was reduced when the business downsized. I heard these things the way you hear distant weather. Noted, not ignored, not dwelled upon. I felt no pleasure in their difficulties. Watching your child struggle, even one who had hurt you, is sad. It remains sad regardless of what led there. That was a low note beneath the better music of that year, and I did not pretend otherwise. But I did not rescue them. That was the line I held, and it was the right line, because no rescue would have addressed the actual problem, which was not a bad quarter or legal bills, but a pattern of behavior that only real consequences could interrupt. Whether it would change, I genuinely did not know. That was between Derek and his own conscience. In September, I heard Derek and Stacy had begun seeing a couples counselor. I chose to view this as a hopeful sign. Diane sent me a Christmas card in December. No mention of yellow tulips or moral obligation. Just thinking of you. Take care of yourself, Peggy. I sent one back. You too, Diane. I meant it. I was not carrying anything that wasn't mine to carry. Frank gave me a small painting for Christmas. A winter garden, blue-gray light, red tulips standing in snow. He had painted it from memory, from a description I'd once given in class of Gerald's garden in January, how the tulips always came back no matter how cold it got. I hung it in the kitchen, where the morning light found it first. I learned 2 things. Love is not the same as surrender. You can love someone completely and still hold them accountable. Those have never been opposites. Keep your own records. Your financial life is your business, an accountant's habit that turned out to be a life habit. If someone had taken $78,400 from you, dismissed your suffering, and then questioned your mind in your own home, what would you have done? Leave a comment. I'd genuinely like to know. Share this if it reached you. Someone you know may need to hear it. Thank you for staying with Peggy. Gerald would have liked you. 25 years ago, I secretly bought a beach house. One day, my 82-year-old husband brought his 23-year-old mistress there. They were laughing, but when they opened the door, I was already waiting for them with my surprise. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Eleanor Marsh, and I was 78 years old the day I understood, with complete and terrible clarity, that the man I had given 54 years of my life to was a stranger. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where all stories worth telling begin. At the beginning, when everything still looked fine from the outside. Richard and I met in 1965 at a church social in Savannah, Georgia. He was 28, broad-shouldered, with the kind of confident smile that made women forget their own names. I was 24, practical-minded, the daughter of a pharmacist who taught me that the only things in life you could truly count on were property and paperwork. We married 8 months later. I wore my mother's dress. He cried at the altar, or at least that's what I told myself for 50 years. Looking back, I think the light was just in his eyes. We built a life the way people did back then, slowly, stubbornly, brick by brick. Richard ran a regional insurance company. I raised our 3 children, Margaret, James, and Caroline, and taught elementary school for 31 years. We had a good house in Hilton Head, South Carolina. We had grandchildren who called on Sundays. We had routines that felt, if not passionate, then solid, reliable, like good furniture. But 25 years ago, something shifted in me. I don't know what exactly triggered it. Perhaps it was watching my friend Dorothy lose everything when her husband left her with nothing but credit card debt and a leased car. Perhaps it was simply the quiet, persistent knowledge that had lived in my chest for years, the knowledge I never let myself name. Whatever it was, in the spring of 1999, I did something I never told a single soul about. I bought a beach house. Not with our joint account. With money I had been setting aside since 1987. A private savings account in my maiden name, Eleanor Patton, at a bank 2 towns over. 31 years of birthday money, Christmas money, a small inheritance from my Aunt Ruth, and careful, patient saving. The house was a modest white clapboard cottage on Fripp Island. 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, 40 yards from the water. I paid $214,000 cash. The deed was in my name alone. I told Richard it was a rental investment I'd inherited from Aunt Ruth's estate. He never asked to see the paperwork. He never did. For 25 years, that house sat quietly in my name, rented out through a local agency, paying its own property taxes, generating modest income I kept in a separate account. Richard knew the house existed in a vague, uninterested way, the way husbands know about things that don't directly concern them. He never went there. He never asked about it. And then, things began to change. It started the year Richard turned 80. Small things. A second cell phone, he said, was for work, though he had been retired for 12 years. Dinners that ran late. A new gym membership, which might have been touching if he hadn't pulled a muscle stepping off the porch the previous winter. A sudden interest in his appearance. New shirts, a different cologne, something sharp and young that didn't belong on an 80-year-old man. I noticed. I had always been a noticer, but I told myself the stories women tell themselves, that I was paranoid, that I was projecting, that men his age didn't, that it was impossible, that after 50 years. Then came the credit card statement I wasn't supposed to see. I found it by accident, slipped between 2 issues of his fishing magazine on the nightstand. A charge for $340 at a restaurant in Charleston I had never heard of. A charge for $189 at a jewelry store. A charge repeated 3 times over 4 months at a hotel on Fripp Island. On Fripp Island, where my house was. I sat on the edge of our bed for a long time, holding that piece of paper, feeling something drain out of me that I have never been able to fully name. It wasn't quite grief. It wasn't quite rage. It was more like the feeling of stepping onto what you thought was solid ground and finding nothing beneath your foot. I hired a private investigator 2 weeks later. His name was Dale Cummings, a retired sheriff's deputy from Beaufort County, and he was discreet, professional, and thorough. It took him 11 days. He sent me 3 photographs. In the first, Richard was walking along the Fripp Island waterfront with a young woman. In the second, they were sitting on a restaurant patio, her hand over his. In the third, and this is the one I have never been able to throw away, they were standing on the front porch of my beach house. My house. The white clapboard porch with the green shutters I had repainted myself in 2019. They were laughing. Her name, Dale told me, was Brittany Coles. She was 23 years old. She worked at a nail salon in Beaufort, and apparently Richard had been telling her that the beach house was his. A little gift, he called it. A place just for them. I read that report sitting at my kitchen table in Hilton Head, with my coffee going cold, and the morning sun coming through the window the way it always did, indifferent and bright. I thought about Dorothy. I thought about my father's advice. I thought about the deed, locked in a safe deposit box at the First National Bank of Beaufort, with my maiden name typed neatly at the top. And then I thought, let them laugh. I had a few things to arrange first. The day after I received Dale's photographs, I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't confront Richard. I didn't cry. Or rather, I cried once, briefly in the shower, where no one could hear me. And then I turned the water to cold and stood there until I could breathe normally again. What I did was sit down at my writing desk with a legal pad and a pen, and I made a list. I have always made lists. My students used to tease me about it, Mrs. Marsh and her lists. But lists are how I think. Lists are how I separate what is real from what is fear. And that morning, I needed very badly to know the difference. On the left side of the page, I wrote, what I have, the Hilton Head house, purchased jointly in 1978. Current value approximately $890,000. Our joint savings account, which held just over $340,000. Richard's pension from the insurance company, which paid $4,200 a month. My teacher's pension, $1,850 a month. A joint investment portfolio worth roughly $280,000. And, separately, quietly, entirely mine, the Fripp Island Beach House, valued now at somewhere between $580,000 and $620,000, and the private savings account connected to it, which held $67,000. On the right side of the page, I wrote, what I could lose. And that list was longer than I wanted it to be. South Carolina is an equitable distribution state, not a community property state. That meant that in a divorce, assets would be divided fairly, which in practice meant a judge would look at the length of the marriage, the contributions of each spouse, and various other factors. After 54 years, with Richard's name on most of our shared assets, the outcome of a divorce was not guaranteed in my favor. A good lawyer could argue many things. Richard had always earned more. He had a habit of minimizing my contributions, the way men of his generation did. I had heard him say it at dinner parties, laughing, Eleanor keeps the home fires burning, as if 31 years of teaching and raising 3 children was simply housekeeping. There was also the question of Richard himself. He was 82, in reasonable health for his age, but not robust. His memory had softened at the edges over the past 2 years. Nothing clinical, nothing diagnosed, but I had noticed. He repeated stories. He forgot appointments. He was, I now understood, with new and ugly clarity, deeply vulnerable to a young woman who knew how to be attentive. I didn't know what Brittany Coles wanted from him, but I could guess. And I could guess who would try to make sure she got it. I was afraid. I want to say that plainly, Because I think women of my generation are expected to be either stoic or hysterical, and the truth is usually neither. I was genuinely frightened of losing the security I had spent a lifetime building, of being 78 years old and starting over, of what it would do to my children, to watch their parents' marriage dissolve in the most humiliating way possible. But underneath the fear, something else was hardening. I thought about the deed in that safe deposit box. I thought about the date on it. April 14th, 1999. 25 years before any of this. I had bought that house when Richard was still faithful, or when I had still believed he was. I had bought it with my own money, in my own name, as a quiet insurance policy against a future I hoped would never come. The future had come. The policy was about to be useful. I made an appointment with a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. I called Patricia Holt, a friend from my book club who had practiced family law for 30 years before retiring. I didn't want to hire her. I didn't want anyone who knew me professionally to be my attorney. What I wanted was her recommendation. I took her to lunch at a quiet place in Bluffton, told her everything, and watched her expression move through surprise, anger on my behalf, and finally, that particular focused look that lawyers get when they are working. She gave me 3 names. She told me to call the first one Sandra Weiss, a family law attorney in Beaufort. That afternoon, she also told me something I had already half known, but needed to hear from a professional. Because the Fripp Island property had been purchased entirely with premarital funds, money that had never touched our joint accounts. And because the deed had always been in my maiden name, and because Richard had never contributed to its mortgage, taxes, or maintenance, the house had a very strong argument for being classified as my separate property. My separate property. Richard could not touch it. More importantly, and this was where I began to see the full shape of what I needed to do, he could not give it away. Because that was what he had been doing, wasn't it? Standing on my porch, showing my house to a 23-year-old girl, letting her believe it was his to give. The arrogance of it was almost beautiful in a terrible way. He had no idea that the ground he was standing on belonged entirely to me. I called Sandra Weiss that afternoon. I told her I needed to understand my legal position before I made any moves. She was calm, thorough, and, as Patricia had promised, excellent. We met 2 days later in her office in downtown Beaufort. I brought the deed, the account records, 25 years of rental income statements, and Dale Cummings' report with the photographs. Sandra looked at everything carefully. Then she looked at me. "Mrs. Marsh," she said, "you have been more prepared for this moment than any client I have seen in 30 years of practice." I told her that my father was a pharmacist, that he had always said, "The best medicine is the one you took before you got sick." She smiled at that. Then she told me what I needed to do next. And sitting in that quiet office with the St. Helena Sound visible through the window and the afternoon light coming in gold and steady, I felt the fear in my chest begin. Not to disappear, but to transform into something I could use. A plan has a shape. When you can see the shape of it, you can hold on to it. I could see the shape of mine. The first official step I took was also the quietest. On a Tuesday morning in October, I drove alone to the First National Bank of Beaufort, retrieved the deed from the safe deposit box, and had it reviewed by Sandra's paralegal to ensure it was properly recorded with the county. It was. Every detail was in order. Eleanor Ann Patton Marsh, my full legal name, listed as sole owner. The second step was less quiet, though Richard didn't know it yet. Sandra and I had agreed on a strategy. Before any divorce proceedings began, we would ensure that the beach house was formally appraised, its ownership status was documented in explicit legal memos, and that its rental history, 25 years of it, was compiled into a record that could withstand any legal challenge. We also contacted the rental agency on Fripp Island to ensure the property's management contract was current and unambiguous. It was. The house was legally mine, operationally mine, and financially mine in every way that mattered. But strategy is one thing. What I lived through during those weeks was another. I went home after each meeting with Sandra and sat across the dinner table from Richard, passing him the salt, asking about his golf game, listening to his stories about men I had met 100 times. And I watched him, the way you watch something you once loved that has become dangerous, carefully, without letting your eyes stay too long. He didn't notice at first, but somewhere around the third week, something shifted in him. I couldn't have told you exactly what tipped him off. Perhaps it was that I stopped asking where he'd been. Perhaps it was that I seemed, for the first time in years, genuinely unbothered. Richard had always needed my anxiety. My questions, my small frictions, had been the proof that I was still invested, still watching, still his. When I stopped providing them, he didn't know what to do with the silence. He started watching me back, little things. He would come into whatever room I was in and find some small task there, something to occupy his hands, an excuse to stay and observe. He checked the mail himself suddenly, when for 30 years he had left it to me. He asked twice in 1 week whether I had spoken recently to Margaret or James, probing, I understood, to see if I had said anything to the children. I hadn't. That was the one instruction Sandra had given me that I had followed without question. Tell no one in your family yet. Not until we had everything in order. Not until we were ready to move. Brittany, I learned, was less patient. Dale Cummings, still on a modest retainer, reported that she had been to the Hilton Head House. She had driven past it twice in 1 week, slowly, the way people do when they are studying something they think might soon be theirs. She was 23 years old and apparently very sure of the future, I thought about her a great deal during those weeks, not with the rage I might have expected. Rage, I have learned, requires energy, and I was spending mine on more useful things. What I felt was something closer to a cold, clinical curiosity. What did she see when she looked at my life? A house, a name, an old woman who could be waited out. The answer came to me sooner than I expected, and from a direction I hadn't anticipated. It was James who, without knowing he was doing anything significant, handed me the evidence I needed. James is my middle child, 49, an accountant, careful and thorough, the child most like me. He called on a Wednesday evening and mentioned, almost in passing, that his father had asked him a question about estate planning. Specifically, Richard had asked him whether, if a piece of property had been in one spouse's name for a long time, there was a way to transfer it jointly before the owner's death. I kept my voice even. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "I told him I'd look into it," James said. "Is there something I should know about, Mom? Is this about the beach house?" So Richard knew, or suspected, that the beach house was mine, and he was already trying to find a way to claim it. After I hung up, I sat very still for a moment in the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed. The evening birds were starting up outside. Normal sounds. Ordinary evening sounds from a life that was no longer what it appeared to be. Then I called Sandra. She was quiet for a moment after I told her. Then, "How much time do you think he'll give himself before he tries to formalize that request?" "Not much," I said. "He's 82. He doesn't think he has much time." "Then neither do we," she said. "Eleanor, it's time to file." I had one more call to make before then. I called Dale Cummings and asked him to obtain, if he legally could, any documentation of what Richard had been telling Brittany Coles about the Fripp Island property. What representation, if any, had he made to her about its ownership? Dale came back to me 4 days later. He had obtained, through sources I will not detail here but all entirely legal, a text message exchange between Richard and Brittany. In it, Richard had written, in plain language, that the beach house was his separate investment and that he was working on getting it set up properly for them both. I read those words standing in Sandra's office on a bright November morning, with the Atlantic a thin blue line visible through the window. His separate investment, my house, my 25 years, my Aunt Ruth's inheritance and my 31 years of careful saving and my name on the deed. His separate investment. I folded the printed page in half. File, I said. Sandra filed the divorce petition on a Friday morning. I know it was a Friday because I remember standing in the parking lot of her office building afterward, watching a woman in a red coat walk a small dog along the sidewalk and thinking, the world looks exactly the same. The petition cited irreconcilable differences. South Carolina is not a fault-based divorce state for most purposes, but the circumstances, the evidence, the text messages, the photographs from Dale's investigation would all become relevant to the equitable distribution of assets. More immediately, Sandra had filed a concurrent motion to establish the Fripp Island property as my separate property, citing the deed history, the source of funds, and the 25 years of sole ownership and management. The motion requested that the court issue a preliminary order preventing any transfer, encumbrance, or modification of the property's title, pending the outcome of the divorce proceedings. The court issued that order by Tuesday. Richard was served on Wednesday afternoon. I was not home when it happened. I had driven to Beaufort for a lunch I did not eat at a restaurant I cannot now name, because I could not be in that house when the process server arrived. Margaret had offered to come stay with me, but I had told her I needed the day alone. That was not entirely true, but it was what I could manage to say. I drove home along the coast road with the marsh grass moving in the October wind and the sky low and gray, and I sat in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside. Richard was sitting in the living room. He had the papers in his hands. He was not crying. He was not broken, not contrite, not the version of him I had spent 50 years knowing. He was, and I want to say this precisely because it mattered. He was furious in the way of a man who has been caught and is choosing to treat it as an attack rather than a consequence. "You went behind my back," he said. "Yes," I said. "I've learned from watching you." He told me I was being vindictive. He told me that at his age, 82, think about it, Eleanor, 82 years old, the stress of this kind of legal proceeding was medically dangerous. He told me that whatever I thought I knew, I didn't understand the full picture. He told me that Brittany was simply a friend, that I was overreacting, that I had always been suspicious and controlling. He actually used those words, standing in the living room of the house we had shared for 30 years, describing my careful, quiet attention as a character flaw. I let him finish. Then I told him, "The Fripp Island house is under a court order. You cannot touch it. Your attorney will explain the rest." I went upstairs. I want to tell you it felt like triumph. It didn't. Not yet. What it felt like was the moment after you pull a splinter. Painful and clean and very, very raw. The calls started the next morning. The first was from Richard's lawyer, a man named Philip Garrett, based in Charleston, who had a reputation for being aggressive in high net worth divorces. He called my cell phone, which I did not answer, and left a message suggesting that Eleanor and Richard should speak directly before matters became unnecessarily complicated. I forwarded the message to Sandra. The second call was from Brittany. She called from a number I didn't recognize. I answered by accident, thinking it might be the rental agency on Fripp Island. Her voice was young. That was the thing that struck me first. How young she sounded. Not in a sympathetic way, but in the way of someone who has not yet learned that youth is not the same as power. She told me that Richard had done nothing wrong. She told me that what he and she had was real, and that I was trying to destroy something I had no right to touch. She told me, and here her voice changed slightly, took on a harder edge, that Richard was planning to contest the separate property designation on the beach house because he had invested in it over the years. When I asked her specifically what investment she meant, she said that he had paid for maintenance and improvements. He had not. I had every receipt, every contractor's invoice, every property tax statement going back 25 years. He had never paid for a single nail. I think, I told her, you should speak with Richard's attorney. She called back twice more that day. I didn't answer. But that evening, something happened that crossed a line. I came downstairs to find Richard at my writing desk, where I kept my files. Going through the lower drawer, he had found a folder of property records. He was photographing pages with his phone. I stood in the doorway and looked at him. "Richard," I said, "put that down." He looked up, and for a moment, just a moment, he looked like someone I recognized, someone tired and old, and perhaps afraid. And then the moment passed, and he said, "These are marital records. I have every right." "You are photographing documents in an active legal proceeding," I said. "I am going to call Sandra in the morning, and then I am going to ask you to leave." He left the house 3 days later at Sandra's written request, which referenced potential contempt proceedings. He went, I later learned, directly to Brittany's apartment in Beaufort, and I stood alone in my house for the first time in 54 years. I gave myself 5 days. I did not call the lawyer. I did not check my email obsessively. I drove out to Fripp Island and sat on the porch of my beach house for 2 of those afternoons, watching the Atlantic, listening to the shorebirds, and letting myself feel, without managing it, everything that was happening. The 5th day, I made fresh coffee, called Sandra, and told her I was ready. Philip Garrett sent a settlement proposal on a Monday. I remember the day because it was the first truly cold morning of November, and the windows of Sandra's office were fogged at the edges when I arrived to review it. The proposal was, professionally speaking, almost insultingly constructed. It offered Eleanor Marsh 54 years of marriage, 3 children raised, 31 years in a classroom, a lump sum of $180,000, her teacher's pension, and the continued use of the Hilton Head House for a period of 5 years, after which the property would be sold and proceeds split 60-40 in Richard's favor. The joint investment portfolio would be divided equally. Richard would retain his insurance company pension in full. There was no mention of the beach house. It was simply absent from the document, as if by not naming it, they could make it cease to exist as a legal matter. I read the proposal twice. Then I set it down on Sandra's desk and looked at her. "They don't believe the court order will hold," I said. "Philip Garrett is testing your resolve," she said. "This proposal is designed to make you feel lucky to receive anything. It's a pressure document, not a genuine offer." She was right, of course, but knowing a trap is a trap doesn't make it easier to look at. The $180,000 would not have lasted long. I was 78. Long-term care costs alone, if I ever needed them, could exhaust that in 3 years. Without the Hilton Head House, without the beach property, without a fair share of the assets I had helped build over 54 years, I would be an old woman dependent on the goodwill of my children. That was what they were banking on, that I would be afraid enough to take it. I was afraid. I sat with the proposal folder on my lap during the drive home and felt, very specifically, the fear of being old and alone and outmaneuvered. It is a particular kind of fear. Not dramatic, not sharp. Just cold. Like a draft under a door. But I had been afraid before. I had been afraid in 1999 when I bought that house. Afraid that I was being paranoid. Afraid that Richard would find out. Afraid of what it meant that I felt I needed an escape route in my own marriage. Fear and I were old acquaintances. I declined the proposal. Sandra's response was 2 pages of clean legal language that essentially said, "This offer does not reflect the equitable value of Mrs. Marsh's marital contributions and is not a basis for negotiation." For 3 days after that, nothing happened. And somehow the silence was louder than anything Richard had said directly to me. I could feel them watching, Richard and Brittany and Philip Garrett, whoever else was involved, recalibrating, deciding what to try next. It was Caroline, my youngest, who first breached my silence about what was happening. She called on a Thursday evening. She had been calling more often since Richard left the house, sensing something without knowing its shape, the way children always can. I had told her only the minimum, that her father and I were separating, that it was serious, that I had legal support. That evening, she simply said, "Mom, are you alone in that house?" And something about the way she asked it, not with drama, just with plain care, made me say, "Come this weekend. Bring the kids." They came Saturday morning. Caroline, her husband Tom, and my 2 grandchildren, 11 and 8. The house filled up with noise and cereal bowls and a soccer ball somehow appearing in the back hallway. I sat at the kitchen table watching my grandchildren argue over the remote control, and I felt something I can only describe as solid. Weight in my feet. Ground under me. Caroline and I sat on the back porch that evening after Tom had taken the children to get ice cream. I told her most of it. Not the ugliest parts, not yet. But enough. The photographs, the text messages, the settlement proposal. She was very still for a moment. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Long enough," I said. "And the beach house, all this time it was yours. Just yours." "Your great-aunt Ruth helped me buy it," I said. "And 30 years of clipping coupons." Caroline laughed at that. A short, startled sound. And then her eyes went bright, and she reached over and took my hand. "What do you need?" she said. I thought about it. "I need people to know I'm not crazy," I said. "And I need someone to sit with me when this gets harder." She squeezed my hand. "Done," she said. Patricia Holt, my book club friend, who had given me Sandra's name, organized it in her quiet way. She called Margaret and James separately and told them the basic facts, with my permission, before I had to. She also told 3 other women in our social circle, women who had known Richard and me for 20-plus years, women who had influence in the community, women whose esteem Richard valued. By the following week, 2 of those women had quietly informed Richard that they were aware of what had happened. They did not issue ultimatums. They simply let him know he was seen. His response filtered back to me through Patricia. He said I was making things up, building a false case against him out of wounded pride. I saved that quote in a notebook. Because wounded pride doesn't produce 25 years of receipts. Wounded pride doesn't put a deed in a safe deposit box. Wounded pride doesn't call a lawyer on a Tuesday afternoon and say, "File." No. What produces those things is foresight and patience, and a father who was a pharmacist and believed that the best medicine is the one you take before you get sick. I was starting to feel a great deal better. They came on a Sunday. I had not been told they were coming. That was the first thing. The absence of warning, the way they simply appeared at the front door on a gray December morning, Richard in his good coat, and Brittany standing slightly behind him in a camel-colored jacket that cost more than my first car. I opened the door. I looked at them both. Richard said, "Eleanor, may we come in?" I should say something about what Brittany looked like in person. I had seen her only in photographs, profile shots, candid images from Dale's surveillance. In person, she was prettier than I had expected, with a kind of careful prettiness, the sort that requires maintenance and knows it. She held herself slightly apart, her expression calibrated to something that was probably meant to read as respectful. It read to me as calculated. I stepped back from the door. They sat in the living room, Richard in the armchair he had used for 30 years, which struck me as either habit or deliberate claim. Brittany sat beside him on the love seat, close but not touching, performing a particular kind of discretion. Richard spoke first. He said that this had all gotten out of hand. He said that he had been foolish. He actually used that word, the careful admission of small guilt designed to preclude the larger guilt from being named. He said that what he and Brittany had was complicated, but that none of it had to mean the end of 54 years. He said that there were ways to handle this that didn't involve attorneys and courts and putting everything we've built at risk. He said, "I think if you were willing to sit down and talk rationally," there it was. The word I had been waiting for. The word that meant, if you would stop insisting on your own reality and accept mine. I sat across from them with my hands in my lap and said nothing. I had learned, in 54 years of marriage and 31 years of teaching, that silence is a more powerful tool than most people give it credit for. When you stop filling the air, people fill it themselves. And they fill it with truth. Brittany spoke next. She said, "And I want to be careful to get this right, because it matters." She said that she understood this was painful for me. She said she had no desire to hurt anyone. She said that she hoped Eleanor could eventually understand that people's feelings were complicated and that love didn't follow the rules we expected it to. Then she said, "And really, for someone your age, it might be easier to accept a clean settlement and, not have to manage property. The beach house especially. That's a lot of responsibility." I looked at her for a moment. "How long have you been waiting," I said, "to say that to me?" Her expression changed, just slightly. The calibrated pleasantness shifted, and underneath it I saw something else. Not quite malice, but something related to it. Impatience. Entitlement. The absolute, unwavering belief that she was the one the story was supposed to go well for. Richard jumped in immediately. "That's not what she meant." "It's exactly what she meant," I said, "and I'd like you to hear my answer." I looked at Brittany directly. "I bought that house with my own money in 1999. My name is on the deed. A court has acknowledged its legal status. Your feelings about it, and I do mean your feelings, Miss Coles, are not a legal argument." Silence. Then Richard leaned forward. And here is where the mask fully came off. Not dramatically, not with shouting, but in the particular cold way of a man who is used to being obeyed. He said, "Eleanor, I'm asking you, as your husband of 54 years, to stop this before it goes any further. Philip tells me we have several legal avenues regarding that property that you may not have considered. This can become very expensive for you, very drawn out, very public." I heard clearly what he was not quite saying. He was not quite saying, "Give up the beach house and we will let you have the rest quietly." He was not quite saying, "Resist us and we will make this cost you more than it's worth." He was not quite saying, "You are old and tired and this will outlast you." He was, in other words, threatening me. In my living room, on a Sunday morning. "I'll see you in court," I said. He stood. He straightened his coat. That gesture, that habitual smoothing, which I had watched him perform after every difficult conversation for 5 decades. He said very quietly, "Don't do this, Eleanor." Brittany was already moving toward the door. I walked them out. I stood on the porch and watched Richard's car, a car I had never seen before, something new, something he had apparently bought sometime in the last year without mentioning it, pull out of the driveway and move down the street until I couldn't see it anymore. Then I went inside, locked the front door, and sat down on the bottom step of the stairs. I am not going to pretend I was unmoved. I sat there for 10 minutes with something cold moving through my chest. Not second thoughts. Not that, not exactly. But a clear-eyed understanding of what he had shown me. That the man I had married was prepared to use a court system, an attorney, and a 23-year-old woman as instruments to strip away what I had built. That he was, at 82 years old, not contrite and not finished. That was frightening. It was also the most clarifying thing that had happened since I first opened that credit card statement. Because if he was still fighting this hard, if he thought there was still something to fight for, then I was doing exactly the right thing. I picked up my phone and sent Sandra a text. They came to the house today. Attempted persuasion, some veiled threat re legal costs. I want to discuss our timeline. I think we should move faster. She responded within the hour. Agreed. I'll call you tomorrow morning. I made myself tea. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the neighbor's oak tree moving in the December wind. The light was thin and gray and absolutely ordinary. I thought, 25 years ago, I bought a house with money I saved in secret. And I thought, I knew, even then, what kind of man I'd married. I just hadn't let myself say it yet. The hearing was scheduled for the 3rd week of January. I dressed carefully that morning. Not performatively. I was not dressing for anyone in the room, not trying to appear sympathetic or frail or impressive. I wore the gray wool suit I had bought for Margaret's eldest child's christening and my mother's pearl earrings, and I took my time over both because I had learned that the rituals of preparation matter in the same way that a surgeon's focus matters before an incision. They are not vanity. They are discipline. Sandra had spent the preceding 6 weeks building a record that was, she told me, the cleanest she had worked with in her career. We had the original deed, dated April 14th, 1999, in my maiden name. The full chain of title documentation showing no transfer or joint ownership at any point. Bank records showing the purchase was funded entirely from my private savings account, which itself could be traced to sources entirely separate from our marital finances. My Aunt Ruth's estate, my personal savings over 12 years, rental income from the property itself, 25 years of property tax payments, all in my name alone. Contractor invoices, maintenance records, rental contracts. Every document showing a sole owner managing a sole property. We had Philip Garrett's settlement proposal, which had notably omitted the beach house entirely, suggesting that even he had recognized at some level the weakness of their position regarding it. And we had the text messages. Richard's own words, his separate investment, his own claim, his own fraudulent representation to Brittany Coles that property belonging entirely to his wife was his to convey. I sat in the courtroom and placed my hands flat on the table in front of me and breathed. Richard sat across the aisle with Philip Garrett. He was wearing a suit I had not seen before. Dark blue, well cut. The suit of a man trying to project authority. He did not look at me when he came in. Brittany was not in the courtroom. This was a civil hearing, not a trial, and she had no formal role here. But I knew she was waiting. Somewhere. She was waiting. Philip Garrett went first. He was polished and aggressive, as Patricia had promised, and he made 3 arguments with considerable skill. The first, that Eleanor had conducted a secret financial transaction during the marriage using funds accumulated during the marriage, which could be characterized as marital assets. The second, that Richard had contributed to the property indirectly through the financial support that had allowed Eleanor to save. The third, that the couple's intention in their overall estate could be construed as unified, making the technical separation of the deed a legal formality rather than a genuine reflection of ownership. They were not bad arguments. I want to say that because I believe in giving credit where it is due. Philip Garrett was a skilled attorney, making the best case available to him. The problem was the evidence. Sandra addressed each point in turn. The savings account predated the marriage's peak income years and had been maintained in my maiden name for its entirety. The source of funds was traceable to my personal inheritance and my teaching salary, documented, verified, and never commingled with joint finances. Richard had been given the opportunity over 25 years to contribute to or be documented in connection with the property, and had not been. Not his name, not his money, not a single transaction. The rental income had flowed into my private account and had been used for property maintenance and reinvestment. Then Sandra put the text messages on the record. Philip Garrett objected. He was overruled. The judge read them quietly. I watched her face. A careful, even face. A judge who had been on the family court bench for 16 years. She read the messages twice. Then she asked Philip Garrett, "Is your client's position that these messages represent a misunderstanding?" There was a pause, the kind of pause that fills a room. Philip Garrett said carefully that his client had made some informal statements that may not have reflected the precise legal ownership status of the property. The judge looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Richard, and something happened to Richard's face. The authority slipped. I watched it go. Not dramatically, not all at once, but incrementally, like a wall showing cracks. The composed, confident expression became effortful, and then the effort became visible, and then it stopped working. What was left underneath was something I had not seen on his face in many years. Uncertainty. Real uncertainty. The kind that comes when a man realizes the story he has been telling has just met the facts. He started to speak. "Your Honor," Richard said, and then stopped. Philip Garrett put a hand on his arm, a small, practiced gesture. "Stop talking." Richard did not stop. "The house was, I always understood that. Eleanor and I had an agreement about—" "Mr. Marsh," the judge said, not unkindly, but firmly. He stopped. I sat very still. I did not look at him with triumph. I did not look at him with pity. I looked at him the way you look at a thing that is finished, with a kind of sad, comprehensive clarity. After the hearing in the corridor, I saw Philip Garrett speaking to Sandra in a low, rapid voice. I didn't hear the words, but I recognized the posture of a man recalibrating what he can reasonably ask for. Sandra came to me afterward and said 4 words. "He's going to settle." I nodded. "On your terms," she added. I looked out the window of the corridor at the January light on the street outside, cold and clean and very clear. I thought of the beach house on Fripp Island, with its green shutters and its porch, and the shorebirds wheeling over the water. "Yes," I said, "he will." The settlement was finalized in February, on a Thursday, in Sandra's office. I want to describe the room, because I find that I remember it very clearly, and I think that is because the body knows when a moment is final, even before the mind catches up. Sandra's office had cream-colored walls and a view of a live oak that had grown too large for the space around it, and was magnificent because of it. There were stacks of documents on the conference table, a carafe of water, 2 glasses, Sandra at the head of the table, Philip Garrett across from us, looking like a man who had accepted an unpleasant meal and was finishing it because he was too professional not to. Richard was not present. He had been advised not to be. That absence, that empty chair, told me everything I needed to know about where he was emotionally and strategically. He was gone from the room in the same way he was gone from our life. Suddenly, after 54 years, just not there. The terms took 3 weeks to negotiate after the hearing. Philip Garrett had initially tried to reassert some of their original positions. Sandra had responded to each attempt with documentation. He had tried to argue the beach house one final time, citing a legal theory about beneficial interest that Sandra had anticipated and was prepared to dismantle. He had tried to revisit the division of the investment portfolio. He had tried to soften the pension terms. Each attempt ran into the same wall: the evidence. 25 years of meticulous documentation. A deed that had never wavered. Text messages in Richard's own handwriting that demonstrated he had always known, exactly whose house it was, even as he told a young woman otherwise. In the end, the terms were these. The Fripp Island Beach House was confirmed as my separate property, removed from the marital estate entirely. It was mine, completely, legally, finally mine. The Hilton Head House, our marital home of 30 years, was to be sold. From the proceeds, I would receive 60%, reflecting my longer financial contribution to its acquisition and maintenance, documented through records Sandra had compiled. Richard would receive 40%. The joint investment portfolio was divided equally. Richard retained his insurance company pension. I retained my teacher's pension. In addition, and this was the point that had taken the longest to reach, the point where Philip Garrett had been most resistant, Richard agreed to a lump sum payment of $95,000 to Eleanor, representing the court's recognition of contributions to the marriage that had not been otherwise compensated in the asset division. I signed my name at the bottom of the final page at 2:47 in the afternoon. Afterward, I learned things I had not known before, things that surfaced as part of the financial disclosure process that divorce requires. Richard had transferred $43,000 from a personal investment account to Brittany Coles over the preceding 14 months. Not to a joint account, not in any instrument that would have made it a recoverable marital asset under South Carolina law, but directly to her, cash transfers, multiple transactions, each just under the reporting threshold. I had suspected, I had not known the number. I also learned that he had co-signed a lease on Brittany's apartment in Beaufort, the same apartment he had moved into when he left our house. The lease was in both their names. He was paying the bulk of the rent. These things were not recoverable from him, legally. The money was gone. The lease was a private matter. But they were relevant to understanding the full picture: what he had been doing, how long he had been doing it, and what he had been willing to spend on the proposition that he could give away what was mine. I did not allow myself to be angry about the $43,000 in the way I might have been angry before the settlement. There is a quality of feeling that sets in after a long legal process. Not quite peace, not quite exhaustion, but something in between. A settling, like sediment after water stills. What I had was this: a legal acknowledgement of my ownership of a property I had bought with my own foresight and my own hands. A fair division of what we had built together. Financial security that would not evaporate. My name, Eleanor Ann Patton Marsh, on documents that said this was hers. And I had something harder to name, but equally real: the knowledge that 25 years ago, a younger version of myself had known something she wasn't ready to say yet, and had acted on that knowledge quietly and carefully, and had been right. Sandra walked me to my car afterward. The February air was cool and smelled of the marsh. She said, "Eleanor, you should be proud of how you handled this." I thought about it for a moment. My father told me, I said, that the best medicine is the one you take before you get sick. I opened my car door. I just wish I'd been wrong enough that I never needed it. She nodded. She understood. I drove home along the coast road. The same road I had driven the day Richard was served. The marsh grass was brown and still in the winter light, and the water was gray and very flat. I drove to Fripp Island. I parked in front of my house, with its white clapboard and its green shutters and its wraparound porch. I sat in the car for a moment. Then I got out, walked up the porch steps, unlocked the door with my key, and went inside. The house smelled of wood and salt and the particular quiet of a place that has been well maintained and patiently waited. I sat in the chair by the front window and looked out at the Atlantic and let the silence happen around me. That was enough. The Hilton Head House sold in April. I had not been sorry to see it go. I moved into the Fripp Island cottage in May. All 3 children came to help. We ate pizza on the porch, watched the grandchildren chase shorebirds until their voices became small with distance. Caroline said that first evening, "This place suits you, Mom." I looked at the water. "I know," I said. That September, I traveled alone to Maine for the first time in 40 years. I called Patricia from a rocky headland with the Atlantic enormous below me. "I feel like a person," I told her. "You were always a person, Eleanor." "I know, but now I feel like one." My grandchildren visited constantly. My house had become a place people wanted to come. That is the truest thing I can say. Richard and Brittany lasted 8 months. By autumn, she had moved to Charleston. He moved into assisted living. His children arranged it. I visited once. When I stood to leave, he said, "You were always more prepared than I gave you credit for." "Yes," I said. "I was. Warm, quiet, entirely mine." That is the story of the beach house, of a deed in a safe deposit box and a savings account in my maiden name. What did I learn? That preparation is the deepest form of self-respect. That legal rights exist to be used. That patience, quietly kept, is more powerful than any confrontation. If something inside you says protect yourself, listen to it. Would you have done what I did? I'd genuinely like to know. Leave a comment below. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourselves.